All right, let's just go back. March 17th in Mosul. What happened?
Ma'am, if I could just start with kind of where we are today,
Okay.
and it gives some context of where we've been up to now. And so where we are today is the Iraqi security forces today are continuing to advance on three axes of division level maneuver. Uh, Coming from the south next to the Tigris, the Federal Police and Emergency Response Division have secured a foothold in a new neighborhood west of Old Mosul. Next to them, just to the west, the Counterterrorism Service, CTS, has advanced to the north and the west, and the Ninth Division has, to the north and west of them, has isolated western Mosul from the west, cut off Mosul to the northwest and south, and seized a major industrial area called a cement plant to the north and west of the city. We're 35 days into operations supporting the Iraqi security forces in West Mosul, and during that period, they've been making continuous progress. Daesh is resisting and is doing everything they can to resist, but they are unable to deny the Iraqi security forces their objectives. And we are witnessing the defeat of ISIS in Iraq. If we go back to March 17th, in that period, you are seeing a similar scheme of maneuver. You are seeing three axes of advance. The federal police are moving up to the southern edge of Old Mosul. The Counterterrorism Service is making advances against a very ferocious enemy that has changed his tactics. And what he's changed from was starting with the initial advance, they were trading terrain for time. And around the middle of March, they ran out of terrain to degrade to, and they started fighting more intensely. To prepare that, they changed from fighting in the open and from lightly prepared positions to very heavily prepared positions. And so if you were at the point of an Iraqi soldier today and at that time, it is a very violent fight for that Iraqi security forces soldier. So a counterterrorism service soldier faces attacks many times a day. He's being attacked by vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, which are vehicles packed with explosives with armor on the front and the sides of them that ISIS tries to use to breach the front line of the Iraqi security forces. He faces attacks by snipers who are using precision fires with heavy weapons to go after him. He faces suicide bombers that are trying to attack him and exploit breaches caused by the vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. And from the defensive fighting positions which the ISIS has prepared, he faces a myriad of attacks. And what they've done is they've taken in the areas that they're fighting. They know the Iraqi security forces are advancing, and they've taken homes, schools, mosques, and prepared defensive fighting positions. In general, in a two-story neighborhood, they've knocked out the windows so that they can fire from the windows. They've knocked out the doors so that they can easily move men, weapons, and equipment into the houses. And they've even knocked down the interior walls to facilitate movement between houses. And then when the Iraqi security forces soldier succeeds, he moves into the area that's occupied by improvised explosive devices. ISIS has laden the houses with prepared improvised explosive devices that will explode either on their command or with activity within the building. And so for each of protection against each of those, he depends on his own air and coalition air support to characterize the environment, to warn him of threats, and to take out threats to his movement.
All right. In terms of from the U.S. side, What is the latest on the investigation into the Mosul strike? And when would you expect that to be completed?
Ma'am, the coalition takes every feasible measure to protect civilians from harm. The coalition takes every allegation seriously and investigates all credible allegations. The commander of Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve has ordered an investigation into this matter. Ma'am, investigations take as long as it takes to complete the finding of the facts and assessments and completing the lessons learned. And I have seen them take a brief time, and I've seen them take a long time. This one, there's a lot of focus on, as are all, and we will use those investigations to modify our tactics, techniques, and procedures so that we continue to take all feasible measures to protect innocent civilians.
Has there been any slowdown in the Mosul operations as you're gathering that information, as you're understanding what happened?
Ma'am, I can tell you that the difference between today and last week is just the date on the calendar. So when the Iraqi security forces, when federal police, Iraqi Army, CTS, stepped off this morning to seize their new objectives, over their head was the same aerial armada that there was last week. A total of 32 coalition fighters and bombers that are supporting them in their maneuver. So when they started off this morning, A-10s, Belgian F-16s, F-22s, and over the day, Australian F-18s, British Tornadoes, all fighters, and even the B-52. Characterizing the battlefield ahead of their movement are dozens of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft, some armed, some unarmed, each with a unique set of capabilities that's enabling us to characterize that battle space, to determine where the enemy is, where civilian populations are, and to support the Iraqi security forces in their advance. In addition, the Iraqis are supporting their own forces with their Iraqi Air Force and Iraqi Army Aviation. The Iraqi Air Force just this month has taken out 34 high payoff targets with their precision-guided munitions in F-16s. Collectively, this week and last week, there has never been an army with more capable air support than the Iraqi security forces.
Do you know right now, going back to March 17th, how many civilians were killed? And given that there is that intense surveillance ahead of time, hours spent before you're carrying out a strike, what happened?
Ma'am, let's go into that. If you're okay, I'd like to develop and talk about what happens ahead of every strike. And so this goes back to way before. First, every strike is requested and approved by an Iraqi general officer, or in the case of protecting the Kurdish forward line, it's approved by the Kurdish Regional Security Council. But way before that ever happens, we start by characterizing the battle space. So before the Iraqis started their movement from the south, coalition spent hundreds of hours of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance characterizing the battle space to determine where the civilians are, where the enemy is, and what the nature of the activities that's going on. And we design our operations around that. So the Iraqis are devoted to protecting the population. They are liberating their country from ISIS. Their operations are based on protecting that population. So the Iraqis chose footholds in the airport area where there were no civilians at the time, where there were no civilians. They chose a foothold in the Ghazlani military complex because there were no civilians and it would protect the civilians, and they were able to get a foothold into the city without endangering civilians. And then their operations are designed and paced around where the civilians are. If you look at East Mosul, the reason it took so long through East Mosul is they were being very deliberate about their movement and being very careful in their movement through the city. Their pace of movement from south to north has been consistent and designed to protect the civilian population. What has changed is the intensity of the fighting. And so, yes, in the middle of March, there was more intense fighting in those areas because Daesh made a decision that they were not going to retrograde anymore, that they were going to prepare lethal engagement areas for the defense of that terrain, that they would clear out what was homes, schools, and mosques and fight from those positions and try to deny the Iraqis from advancing any further. And so the only thing that had changed up to that point was not the measure of care, but the nature of the enemy fighting. With each strike there that the Iraqi security forces saw necessary for their advancement would start by a request from them. We have advisors that are working with them that share the same picture and understanding of the battle space at the commander's level, at the tactical and operational level. That gets...
I just
Yes,
want to
ma'am.
see if I'm understanding what you're saying. So on March 17th, you've done all this extensive surveillance, looking to see where Islamic State is operating. But at that time, they had changed their approach, they had changed their tactics, and that's what happened. Am I understanding this correctly?
So, ma'am, I won't comment on the particulars of the ongoing investigation. But as the Iraqi security forces approached, if you can imagine, the area of west of Old Mosul, as they approached the area, if Old Mosul stretched in a line across the city east-west, as they approached that line of Old Mosul, Daesh's tactics changed from fighting a defense in depth, a deliberate defense in which they retrograded, to holding terrain. We saw Daesh, rather than retrograding, reinforcing areas. We saw Daesh attempting to do offensive operations and to breach the Iraqi security forces' flots. Typically, those type of attacks would start with a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. In the case and time of this period of time, we saw them using multiple vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. In some cases, more than 10 VBIDs in a single attack. So the level of intensity there for their attempting to hold that terrain was intense. They also were fighting not just their shock troops and offensive action fighting with suicide vests, but their defensive forces were fighting with suicide vests.
If we can just go back, what
Yes,
about the civilian death toll that day, and what about the death toll of Islamic State? What can you tell us about those numbers that day?
Ma'am, let's go back to the characterization. And so when an Iraqi security forces leader decides that he needs, out of military necessity, to conduct a strike to enable his movement, he will nominate that via his advise and assist officer. It goes into a strike cell where that target location is compared with imagery and is compared to where the civilians are, where those intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets have charted and tracked where civilians are, where the enemy activity is. There are some areas where it is exclusively held by the enemy. They have taken entire blocks and cleared out civilian populations and turned those entire blocks into defensive fighting positions. But there are other areas that they have not cleared out. And the default assumption is that in every area that it is a civilian occupied structure, that is a civilian structure, and that every human in the area is a civilian until proven otherwise. And so that of distinction. I'm sorry, ma'am. Go ahead.
Just another thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of looking at the U.S. side of this fight and the rules of engagement. Have they been changed? Have they been any way loosened since January 20th?
So, ma'am, we don't fight as we are not fighting as the U.S. We are a coalition of 23 nations that are sharing a common visualization of the battle space. And in the air side, the coalition shares a common approach to this. And what I can tell you is there is nothing, our mission to advise, assist, enable, train, and equip has not changed the entire time that I have been here. What has changed, and I've been here since May, is the effectiveness of the Iraqi security forces. Every day they have gotten better at fighting, and every day they grow more confident and more capable. And so even this month, I have seen them change to the consistency of their operations. In East Mosul, they routinely had to pause and reset. In West Mosul, they are able to sustain high levels of combat operations. And I think that when you're seeing the continuous careful movement, you're seeing a capable, friendly force. I have
Okay, so again, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this.
Yes.
We've had a change of administrations in the United States.
Yes,
From your vantage point in this battlefield, there has not been a change in terms of how the U.S. is operating in Iraq with the change in the administration. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that.
Ma'am, at my level, our mission to advise, assist, enable, train, and equip has not changed. Our level of support to the Iraqi security forces has not changed. What the coalition air in enabling the Iraqi security forces, the level of support and how we support have not changed. Ma'am, I can tell you clearly that nothing has changed for me in the way that we are approaching the support of the Iraqi security forces in their fight to liberate Mosul.
Okay, I'm also hoping we can just kind of look a bit further ahead. What are the plans for securing Mosul after Islamic State is removed and preventing ethnic and secular conflicts from becoming part of a problem?
Ma'am, I'll tell you, we are working side by side with the Iraqis security forces on every phase of this operation. And so the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government were planning for that phase of the operation well before this operation ever started. So even before October 17th. Ma'am, if you can mirror image what's going on in East Mosul. East Mosul is the Iraqis are already doing that. They have a whole force in place that is maintaining security. There are schools that are open. The population is moving around and conducting commerce. There are markets that are open. It doesn't mean that there are not challenges, but the Iraqis are fully aware of those challenges and are tackling those head on. In West Mosul, they're doing the same thing.
Are there any, I guess part of what I'm wondering, are there any kind of agreed upon rules for Iraqi forces, Shiite militias, Kurds, and U.S. forces?
Ma'am, we are supporting the Iraqi security forces in their plan. And every one of their security forces has very important roles as we in the liberation of Mosul, in the securing of Mosul and the transition to Tal Afar. Every one of them, they are playing to the strengths of those unique aspects. So you've seen there's a significant difference in capabilities between them, and each one is playing within their important roles. I do think that we also need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that are ahead in West Mosul. So there is immense suffering in West Mosul right now. Daesh has taken hospitals. They've taken the food, the fuel, the medicine for their use. They are trapping civilians there, using them as human shields. And the quickest way that the Iraqis see to end the suffering is for the Iraqis to liberate their city from ISIS.
Is there any sense at this point that the Trump administration is prepared to contribute to a reconstruction effort?
Ma'am, at this level, I'm focused on our mission to advise, assist, enable, train, and equip the Iraqi security forces. The coalition has agreed to that mission, and we are focused on that entirely. I'm not an expert on all the other measures that coalition nations are considering.
I guess another thing, can the U.S. prevent a repeat of what's happening in Afghanistan without maintaining a significant force in the country for a significant period of time?
Ma'am, I'll just use the example of our mentorship of the Iraqi Air Forces. Is where we are making a difference is at the tactical level, working with them, but also at the operational level. So we're already working with the Iraqi Air Force and Iraqi Army Aviation on counterinsurgency operations. In fact, the Iraqis are doing them now concurrent with their overall operations to clear Mosul. So when you look at what's going on the east side, in East Mosul, the Iraqis are conducting effective counterinsurgency operations because Daesh has left behind sleeper cells, and they are going after those sleeper cells in order to keep the population secure. So that same model, I have full confidence that the coalition will work with the Iraqi security forces to help them in their mission to secure this country.
Deborah, we're running short on time.
Okay, could I just do two more quick questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we have a report that the Iraq's military said on Sunday that 61 bodies were recovered from a collapsed building that Islamic State had booby-trapped in West Mosul, but there was no sign the building had been hit by a coalition airstrike. The military statement differed from reports by witnesses and local officials that said as many as 200 bodies were pulled from the building after a coalition strike last week targeted Islamic State militants and equipment. Any clarification you can offer us?
Ma'am, I think as we consider that battle space, I think what will help us is to be clear-eyed about the enemy that we're facing. And the enemy that the Iraqi security forces is fighting is one that is strapping bombs to children to attack the Iraqi security forces. It uses snipers to attack civilians fleeing from their homes. It traps civilians in their homes and attempts to use them as human shields. This enemy turns churches, schools, mosques, and homes into defensive fighting positions. And so I think that we need to consider the enemy that the Iraqi security forces are liberating this city from, and the enemy that we as a coalition are assisting them with. I really appreciate your time.
Just as a quick final question, from your vantage point, the U.S. first went into Iraq in 2003. It was a different kind of enemy, at least, looking at it from this end in Washington, D.C. How difficult has that adjustment been? What are the challenges of when the enemy changes on the battlefield?
So, ma'am, I supported the Iraqi security forces in 2008, was the last time. And it was the first time that they were using their forces under their command and control to clear significant areas. In this case, it was Basra and then Sadr City. And what I saw was with each operation, they grew stronger and more confident. I'm seeing that throughout my entire time here. So since May, I've seen them grow stronger and more confident as they moved up the Tigris, as they moved out the Euphrates, as they cleared Fallujah. And then even between East and West Mosul, I'm seeing their capabilities increase both on the ground and in the air. And what I have confidence in is the Iraqis will be able to secure their country once they have liberated it from ISIS.
So you think this war will finally end someday?
Ma'am, this is a difficult enemy, and I think we have a long road ahead to support the Iraqis in the liberation of their country. But I see the Iraqi security forces as strong enough to hold their own country and to be able to protect themselves. And so I think that within Iraq, I am confident in their capabilities in the future.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and I hope we can speak again about where things stand. This is, very helpful for all of us to understand what's going on in Iraq.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you for covering this. These are really hard questions that I think we need to have a dialogue on, and so I appreciate us being able to have a candid and effective discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much, and I hope we can do this again.
Yes, ma'am.